She never thought it would happen to her. Until it did. What happened next? You won't believe it. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from and what time it is. It was an ordinary evening for Sarah Williams, a black woman, driving back from a late work shift. The roads were quiet, the soft hum of her car's engine the only sound she could hear. It had been a long day, but she felt the relief of nearing home, where her husband, Officer Charles Williams, would be waiting for her. She was just a few miles away when everything changed. The flashing lights appeared in her rearview mirror. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She pulled over, just as she had done countless times before. But this time, something felt different. She didn't know why, but her gut told her this stop wouldn't be like the others. It wasn't long before two officers approached her car. One of them, a tall man with a stern face, knocked on her window. "License and registration," he said, his voice cold. Sarah calmly handed over her documents, trying to stay composed. Her mind raced. The officer had a look on his face that made her uncomfortable, but she kept her thoughts to herself. The second officer, a woman, was standing by, scanning the surroundings. Sarah knew the drill. She tried to stay polite, to keep things smooth, but something in the air was tense. The officer took a long time with her papers, and she couldn't help but notice his eyes lingering on her a little too long. "Is everything okay, officer?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. The officer didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked back to his car, talking quietly to the other officer. Sarah felt a rising unease. She sat up straighter in her seat, her eyes scanning the road around her, looking for any sign of what might be coming. The minutes ticked by, and Sarah's nerves were on edge. Then, out of nowhere, the officer returned to her car. But this time, something was different. "Get out of the car," he ordered sharply. Her heart pounded in her chest. "Excuse me?" Sarah responded, shocked by the abrupt command. "You heard me," the officer repeated, his voice now laced with irritation. "Why are you doing this?" Sarah asked, trying to make sense of the situation. The officer didn't answer. He opened her door, and before she could react, he grabbed her arm and pulled her out of the car. Sarah was stunned. Her feet barely touched the ground as he yanked her, pushing her forward. The second officer didn't say a word, only stood by, watching. "Stop resisting!" the first officer barked as Sarah tried to pull back. But she wasn't resisting. She was in shock. Her mind raced. Why was this happening? "Please, officer, what did I do?" she pleaded, trying to make sense of the situation. But the officer ignored her, continuing to pull her away from the car. As she stumbled, feeling helpless, she caught a glimpse of something that froze her in place. In the distance, headlights from another car were approaching fast. Sarah tried to focus, her eyes darting towards the light, but she couldn't make out the figure coming closer. Then she heard a voice, a deep, familiar voice. "Is there a problem here, officers?" the voice asked. It was calm but carried authority. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She knew that voice. She turned her head, and there he was, Charles, her husband. He stepped forward, his badge gleaming in the light, his uniform sharp and well-pressed. The two officers stopped in their tracks, their faces changing from irritation to panic in a split second. Sarah could see the sudden shift, the shock on their faces. They hadn't realized who they were dealing with. The officer who had dragged her out of the car froze. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The second officer's face went pale as they both looked at Charles. He didn't even need to say a word. The badge on his chest said everything. "You have no right to treat her like that," Charles said, his voice steady but full of authority. The officers exchanged uncomfortable glances, their posture shifting. And suddenly, the situation felt completely different. Sarah stood still, her heart pounding, trying to process everything that had just happened. What had started as a routine traffic stop had escalated into something completely unexpected. And now, in the presence of a Supreme Court officer, everything was about to change. The moment Charles stepped forward, showing his badge, everything about the situation shifted. The two officers, who had been so aggressive and unbothered moments ago, now stood there, their faces pale and stiff. Sarah could feel the change in the air. It was palpable. What was once a simple traffic stop had now become something entirely different, something that no one was prepared for. The officer who had pulled her out of the car, the one who'd been leading the charge, looked from Charles's badge to his face, visibly shaken. The second officer, a woman, took a step back, avoiding eye contact. She seemed unsure, uncertain, as if she was caught in a situation beyond her control. For a brief moment, there was complete silence. Charles didn't raise his voice, didn't make any grand gestures, but there was a calm power in his presence that made the officers uneasy. Sarah stood there, still trying to catch her breath, her mind racing. This was her husband, her protector. But in this moment, she saw a side of him that was entirely professional. Someone who commanded respect, who had the authority to change everything with just one move. "You've made a mistake," Charles said, his voice steady but firm, and his eyes locked onto the officer who had grabbed Sarah. "You have no business treating my wife this way." The officer's grip on Sarah's arm loosened as he looked down at the ground, ashamed. The other officer, still standing nearby, shifted uncomfortably on her feet, but neither dared to speak. Charles took a small step closer, his posture unwavering, his presence undeniable. Sarah could feel the tension in the air, the weight of the moment settling in. Her heart still raced, not from fear, but from a realization. This was more than just an incident. This was a clear example of how something so simple could spiral out of control. It didn't matter who you were. Sometimes being in the wrong place at the wrong time meant being treated unjustly. The first officer, clearly embarrassed, cleared his throat. "I didn't know. I didn't realize who you were," he muttered, barely audible. "That's exactly the problem, isn't it?" Charles responded, his gaze hardening. "You didn't take a moment to see who she was, to understand that she's a person, not just some suspect." The words hit harder than Sarah expected. She had been treated like an object, someone who could be tossed around without a second thought. But now, standing next to her husband, she felt like the world was shifting. The injustice she'd faced wasn't just about her. It was about every black person who had ever been unfairly treated by those in power. "You don't get to do that to her," Charles continued. "You don't get to treat my wife, or anyone else for that matter, like a criminal just because of their skin color. Do you understand that?" The officer nodded stiffly, still avoiding eye contact. He had nothing more to say. Charles's voice didn't waver, but Sarah could see the anger just beneath the surface, a controlled rage that was hard to miss. Charles turned to Sarah. "Are you okay?" he asked, his tone softening just for her. Sarah nodded, still processing what had just happened. The officer stood silent, knowing they had no response. Charles's calm demeanor was more effective than any shout or threat ever could have been. Sarah couldn't help but feel a wave of relief wash over her. She was shaken, but she was also proud of her husband, proud that he had stood up, not only for her, but for what was right. "Get back in the car, Sarah," Charles said. His voice was gentle now, the authority in it gone, replaced by concern. Sarah walked back to the car slowly, her hands shaking as she got in. The two officers stood there, still unsure of what to do. As Charles approached the car, he turned to them one last time. "You'll be hearing from Internal Affairs," he said, his voice firm once more. "Make sure you learn from this." With that, Charles slid into the car next to Sarah, and they drove off into the night. Neither spoke for a few moments, letting the weight of the situation sink in. But eventually, Sarah reached over, placing her hand gently on his. "Thank you," she whispered. Charles squeezed her hand, his eyes still focused on the road ahead. "I would do it again 1,000 times over for you." The drive home felt longer than usual, but as they pulled into their driveway, Sarah knew that this incident was far from over. She could only hope that it would spark something, that it would be the beginning of real change. The following morning, as the sun began to rise over the city, Sarah couldn't shake the events of the previous night. What had started as a simple car ride had turned into something that would weigh heavily on her mind for days, maybe weeks. It wasn't just the fact that she was unfairly targeted by those two officers. It was the realization that, despite all the progress the world had made, incidents like this were still happening every day, to so many people. And so many times, those who had the power to make a difference never even realized the weight of their actions. Charles had been quiet that morning, focusing on his coffee and reading through a few case files. The morning after the encounter, he had a quiet determination in his eyes. Sarah watched him as he sipped from his mug, knowing there was more he wasn't saying. She knew how much this situation had shaken him too, but he was always the one who kept his calm, kept his focus, especially in public situations. Sarah, on the other hand, was still processing. The whole idea of what happened kept coming back to her in waves. The surprise of being dragged out of her car, the shock on the officer's face when Charles showed his badge, and that brief, intense silence. She had seen that look on Charles before, in the courtroom when he was up against a tough case. It was the look of someone who had everything under control, someone who knew how to command respect. But at that moment, it had been about something bigger. It wasn't just about him winning or being in control of the situation. It was about making sure justice was served, no matter what. Charles put down his coffee and gave her a soft smile, sensing her unease. He reached over and gently took her hand. "You're okay, Sarah," he said quietly, his voice full of reassurance. "I'm trying to be," Sarah replied, her voice wavering just a little. "But I can't help but think about all the people who don't have someone to pull out a badge. What happens to them?" Charles paused, his eyes thoughtful. He knew exactly what she meant. There were so many stories of people, mostly people of color, being treated unfairly without a second thought, and often they didn't have the power to do anything about it. They didn't have a lawyer for a husband, a Supreme Court judge who could put an end to such injustice with a single word. "This can't just be about us," Charles said, his voice firm with conviction. "It has to be about something bigger. This is the moment. We need to make sure that what happened to you doesn't happen to anyone else." Sarah looked up at him, her heart filled with a quiet determination. "But how?" Charles gave her a knowing smile, his eyes lighting up with purpose. "It starts with us, Sarah. We have to speak out, make sure that everyone knows about what happened. We need to make sure people understand that this kind of behavior can't continue." For a moment, they both sat in silence, the weight of the words hanging in the air. They knew this wasn't just about one officer's mistake. This was about a systemic problem, an ongoing issue in their society. People of color were often treated as suspects, as criminals, even without any reason. Charles had spent years working hard to build a reputation, to prove that he was capable and that he deserved to be where he was. But despite all the accolades and success, he knew there would always be people who judged him by the color of his skin. And his job, his career, couldn't change that. But what he could change was how others viewed the world, how they understood the struggles of people like Sarah, like him, and like countless others who face discrimination every day. "Let's make sure they know," Charles said, his eyes narrowing with a sense of purpose. "Let's make sure this doesn't just go away. We'll file complaints, get the story out there. We'll talk to the media. We'll make sure this is heard." Sarah nodded. She could feel a surge of hope rising inside her. The thought of speaking out, of sharing their story, gave her the strength she needed to push forward. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about a bigger fight, a fight for justice, for equality, for respect. The morning went by in a blur. Charles took a few phone calls, made a few more arrangements, and by the afternoon, they had already set the wheels in motion. Their story was going to be heard. But Sarah knew this was just the beginning. Their fight for justice wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to happen overnight. But together, they were ready, and they were going to make sure that no one ever had to face the same injustice again. As Charles looked at her, a silent understanding passed between them. They had something powerful on their side now, each other and a shared mission to make sure their story was heard, loud and clear. The days following the incident were filled with a quiet but steady intensity. Charles and Sarah knew they couldn't let the events fade away. They had both witnessed too much injustice throughout their careers to sit back and do nothing. The support they had been receiving from friends, colleagues, and even strangers was overwhelming. But for Charles, the journey was just beginning. This wasn't just about standing up for his wife. It was about standing up for every individual who had ever been unfairly targeted or mistreated by those who should have been protecting them. It was a Tuesday when they decided to take their next step. They were meeting with their lawyer, a man named Roger, who had been by their side since the beginning of Charles's career. Roger was known for his relentless pursuit of justice, and he was just as fired up as they were. When they entered his office, they could feel the weight of what they were about to do. They were about to take this fight beyond just their personal ordeal and push it into the public eye. Roger was already waiting for them at his desk, papers strewn across it, his fingers drumming against the wooden surface. He looked up and, without hesitation, nodded in their direction. "We're going to need to hit them hard," he said, his voice calm but firm. "The police department won't back down easily, but we've got the right resources. We've got a case here that's not just about misconduct, but about a larger issue: systemic racism." Charles nodded, but it was Sarah who spoke first. "We want to make sure people understand that this is bigger than one bad officer. This is about how black people are treated every single day, whether they're in a car, in a store, or even at home." Roger smiled slightly, impressed by her words. "Exactly. This isn't just about one incident. It's about showing the world that this kind of behavior won't be tolerated." The plan was straightforward. They would file an official complaint against the officers involved, and they would also make sure that the story reached the public eye. They had to take action fast. In today's age, stories spread quickly, but so did misinformation. The narrative had to be right. Charles and Sarah couldn't afford to let anyone twist what had happened. As the meeting continued, Charles could sense that there was a deeper level of commitment from everyone involved. This wasn't just about a few headlines or social media posts. It was about making sure the message resonated with people. It was about educating the public on the realities of systemic racism. No matter how powerful or untouchable some might seem, everyone had to be held accountable. Later that afternoon, as they prepared to meet with a journalist from one of the city's major news outlets, Sarah felt a mixture of apprehension and resolve. She wasn't sure how the media would respond, but she knew that this was the platform they needed. This was their chance to turn the narrative around. "We'll be fine," Charles said, sensing her unease. "We've got the truth on our side." He was right. The truth was the one thing they couldn't be denied. But as Sarah looked at him, she also realized something. She was afraid, not for herself, but for everyone who had ever felt the sting of unfair treatment. She was afraid that no matter how much they fought, the system might never change. The reality was that people like them had been fighting for equality for generations, and it seemed like the fight would never end. The meeting with the journalist was everything they had hoped for and more. The journalist was eager to hear their side of the story, and within minutes they were opening up, explaining everything that had transpired the night of the arrest. The story was being framed in a way that would shed light not only on the misconduct of the officers, but also on the broader issues surrounding race and law enforcement. By the end of the interview, Sarah and Charles felt a sense of clarity. They had done what they could, and now the world would know what had happened. The story would be out there, and it was up to everyone else to understand the weight of it. No matter how long it took, they were willing to keep pushing for change, for their children, for their future. As they walked out of the newsroom, Sarah took a deep breath. The hardest part was over. But the work was far from finished. This wasn't just their story anymore. It was everyone's story, and together they were going to make sure that the message was heard, loud and clear. As the story began to spread, the city was divided. The arrest of Sarah and the subsequent revelation about Charles's true identity created a storm of reactions. Some rallied behind them, praising their bravery for speaking out, while others, especially those who hadn't experienced such discrimination firsthand, were skeptical. The police department, now in the spotlight, issued an initial statement claiming the officers had acted within the bounds of the law. But that didn't stop the growing wave of outrage from echoing across the city. On the surface, the narrative seemed simple. A black woman wrongfully pulled from her car, a police officer who overstepped his boundaries, and a husband who was, quite literally, a force to be reckoned with. But underneath, the complexity of the situation began to unravel, revealing a much larger and more systematic issue. This wasn't just one rogue officer, it was a reflection of an institution that had failed to address the deep-rooted biases that existed within it. Charles was no stranger to the complexities of law enforcement, having spent years as an attorney and later as a Supreme Court judge. But even he found himself taken aback by the depth of the conversation this incident sparked. The conversation wasn't just about the misconduct of one officer, it was about the need for reform, for transparency, and for accountability in police departments everywhere. But not everyone was on board. In the days following the incident, Charles began to receive threatening messages, anonymous letters, and calls from people who were angry that he was bringing attention to the issue of police brutality. They didn't want to hear it. They didn't want to acknowledge the uncomfortable truth that systemic racism was real, and it was hurting people. But Charles wasn't backing down. As a judge, he understood that silence only perpetuated the problem. His position gave him the power to make real change, and he couldn't let this moment pass without doing something significant. He knew it wasn't just about Sarah or him. It was about every single person who had ever felt the sting of racial injustice. One evening, Charles was sitting at his desk, reviewing the details of his case when his phone buzzed. It was an urgent call from a fellow judge, a close friend who had been following the news closely. "Charles, I need you to be careful," his friend warned. "You're stirring up a lot of trouble with the department. Some people don't like the attention this case is getting, and they're not going to let you go this easily." Charles paused, feeling the weight of the warning. He knew what was at stake. He had always believed in the law, in the system that was supposed to protect everyone equally. But now, more than ever, he realized just how far the system still had to go. He didn't need to be reminded of the dangers that came with challenging an institution as powerful as the police force. But his resolve had only strengthened. He ended the call with a promise to keep pushing forward, no matter what. Meanwhile, Sarah was beginning to find her own voice in the aftermath. At first, she had been shaken, but the outpouring of support from people across the community, including other black women who had faced similar struggles, gave her the strength to keep fighting. She was learning that speaking out wasn't just about herself or her family. It was about every woman, every mother, every daughter who had ever been treated unfairly because of the color of their skin. The following day, they held a press conference. It wasn't just a chance for Sarah and Charles to tell their side of the story. It was an opportunity for them to lay out their vision for change. Sarah, usually reserved and private, stood tall behind the podium. She wasn't afraid to speak her truth anymore. "This is bigger than me," she said, her voice unwavering. "This is about making sure no one, not one person, ever has to experience what I went through that night. It's about accountability. It's about justice." Charles stood beside her, his presence commanding. He didn't need to say much. His silence spoke volumes. He knew this fight would take time, but the truth was on their side. Together they were stronger than any department or institution. The press conference was covered widely, and soon other communities began to echo their calls for justice. The conversation that had started with one woman's wrongful arrest had quickly grown into a national conversation about police reform. It was clear now that this was more than just a local issue. It was a movement that needed to be heard. The following week, the City Council announced plans to review the police department's training protocols and policies regarding racial bias. Though it wasn't a guarantee of change, it was a step in the right direction. The fight wasn't over, but it had shifted into a new phase. Sarah and Charles had sparked something, and though they still had a long road ahead of them, they knew one thing for sure: they were no longer fighting alone. The days following the press conference saw the momentum continue to build. What had started as a tense moment on the side of the road was now reverberating through the entire country. The events of that night, when Sarah was dragged from her car by officers, were now part of a larger narrative, one that involved years of racial injustice, systemic inequality, and the urgent need for change. The city, once divided over the incident, began to unite around a common cause. Protests started forming in different neighborhoods, not just in support of Sarah and Charles, but as a collective plea for reform. People of all races, ages, and backgrounds came together, holding signs that read, "Justice for Sarah" and "End Police Brutality." What was remarkable was the diversity of those in the crowds. White allies, Latino communities, and other marginalized groups all stood side by side with Black residents, showing solidarity in ways that were long overdue. Sarah and Charles knew that this fight was far from over. In fact, they understood that the real battle was just beginning. While the public outcry was powerful, change would come slowly, piece by piece. It wouldn't happen overnight, and there would be resistance along the way. But what had been sparked wasn't something that could be easily extinguished. This wasn't just about one police officer or one arrest. It was about the larger, systemic issues that had plagued law enforcement for generations. As Charles continued to work through the legal channels, advising on police reform bills and reviewing training protocols, he faced increasing pressure from the establishment. Some of his colleagues in the judicial system were uneasy about his public stance. They warned him about the risks of challenging the status quo, about the enemies he might make. But Charles had been through enough to know that progress always came with resistance. If he had to be the one to speak out, to shake the foundations, then so be it. Meanwhile, Sarah's role had transformed. She was no longer just the woman who had been wrongfully arrested. She had become a symbol of resilience, of strength in the face of adversity. She was speaking out in forums, meeting with local organizations, and lending her voice to the movement. She met with young women and men who had faced similar situations, and her story helped them find the courage to share their own. Sarah was no longer just the victim. She was a force for change, and she knew the importance of using her voice for the greater good. But despite all the support, despite all the progress they had made, there were still moments of doubt. Sarah often found herself reflecting on that night, replaying the events in her mind. She wondered if there was something she could have done differently. Maybe she could have resisted less. Maybe she could have avoided the confrontation. But then she reminded herself the problem wasn't with her actions. The problem was with the officers, with a system that had failed her and countless others before her. The moment that had once terrified her, the moment when her world felt like it was crumbling around her, had transformed into something greater. Sarah realized that sometimes the hardest moments are the ones that shape us the most, that define us. Meanwhile, as the days passed, Sarah and Charles continued to see the fruits of their efforts. The police department, facing mounting pressure from local and national authorities, announced a series of reforms. They promised better training for officers on racial bias and de-escalation techniques, and they would soon be implementing new policies regarding how civilians should be treated during traffic stops. It was a step, but Sarah and Charles both knew it was just the beginning. As the local community rallied behind them, Charles addressed a large gathering of protesters at a city hall meeting. His voice was calm but strong. "This isn't just a fight for my wife. This is a fight for every person who's ever felt the weight of systemic injustice on their shoulders," he said. "We are only just beginning to turn the tide, and together we will make sure this never happens again." The applause that followed was deafening, and in that moment, Sarah looked out over the crowd and saw hope. Real, tangible hope. Change was on the horizon. But even more than that, she saw something that brought her peace. The power of unity, of people coming together in the face of injustice. They were no longer alone. Sarah and Charles had turned a deeply painful experience into a force for change, demonstrating the power of resilience and the importance of standing up against injustice. But the fight isn't over. Every step toward change requires continued support, understanding, and action. If you believe in justice, if you believe in equality, then be a part of this movement. Share your thoughts, raise your voice, and stand with those fighting for a better future. What's your take on the fight for justice in today's world? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to share this story to keep the conversation going.